If you are a follower of Brexit news like myself, you will have seen, certainly over the past couple of days, Brexiteers crowing about the fact that the EU has failed to get an Australian free trade deal when we have this, quote, fantastic Australian free trade deal, and how wonderful it is and how amazing it all is. And of course, this is the part where I remind you, of course, of the quote of George Eustace, who stood up in the House of Commons and said that the Australian free trade deal was absolutely awful and signed out of pure desperation. And as we also found out, done on the back of a bog roll. Liz Truss and Boris Johnson gave away the farm, essentially, to secure an Australian trade deal, which adds nothing to our GDP in the long term. As we've always said, when you're talking about GDP, you're talking in the billions of pounds. But in reality, this is 0.03% that it will add to our GDP. That is nothing. I've got to stress nothing in the grand scheme of things. But that's why the Brexiteers used of course, the big numbers, because of course, those billions, they're big numbers. If you've got a big number and you've signed this trade deal, it should be good. Never mind the fact, of course, about the consequences of it, that we have put essentially a ticking time bomb on the UK farming industry. And you have seen the National Union of Farmers screaming from the top of their lungs about this trade deal and how bad it is and how it is going to massively undercut UK farmers. Well, what happened when it came to the EU? They got to an impasse where, well, we've ended up beefing about beef. So let's look into this, why this trade deal fell to come to some sort of an agreement, and why the Australians have become so annoyed at the EU for, well, not rolling over like we did, that they're now going to put this trade deal on pause. Meanwhile, the EU will just go, okay. The truth is, they don't care. They've got a big enough market as it already is, with numerous other trade deals that they are doing around the world and have already set up. They don't really care. So this is hardly, as a lot of Brexiteers are saying, some form of magnificent Brexit win. But before we do get into the rest of this, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page and a one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can buy me coffee. There is also the YouTube thank you button as well down below. And of course, there is the YouTube Pony Club as well. So how did this all come to be? Well, as we said, it was about agricultural imports. So, according to Dombrovskis, that is the EU negotiator, the chief EU negotiator in this, the proposed free trade agreement would have guaranteed commercially meaningful market access to Australian agricultural products such as beef, sheep meat, sugar, and dairy. The entry of these goods into the bloc's single market is traditionally subject to high tariffs due to their potentially disruptive effect on European farmers, who tend to object at any sort of foreign competition. And of course, they do this all the time. Even our own farmers are complaining about this, because Australian farms, the amount of agricultural stuff that they output disrupts the domestic market. In this case, we're going to see it in ours in a couple of years. The domestic market that our farmers now have to farm in. It makes their meat, selling their meat in their own domestic market, almost not worth it. So this is why even though there was some sort of agreement to allow these things, to lower these tariffs, the Australians still weren't happy with it. So the European Commission, it continues with, came up with an offer to lower these tariffs and create market access worth at least $1 billion of Australian dollars every year. And senior EU officials explained that, speaking on condition of anonymity, the offer was designed to be economically and politically sustainable for both sides. But then the EU officials, Farrell, surprised negotiators with new demands for greater market access that were fundamentally incompatible with the Commission's proposal, particularly in regards to beef and sheep meat. And Farrell's request was seen as excessive when aligned with the ambitious interests of Australian farmers, making it impossible to find a compromise in the near term. So, what you have here and what really happened was you had the Australian farmers market lobby come in and say, that's not good enough. You know, your 1 billion Australian dollars, which just would add to our add to our pockets every year, that's not good enough. Why? Because the UK has just caved and given us everything we want. We want that. We want that. What the UK has just caved and given into us. We want that. But of course, the EU's not going to do that. They've got better negotiators. They've got better people who know, to be honest, what's going on and what the Australian game plan here is to outperform massively, pump out a load of these, cheap, farm products and massively disrupt domestic markets in the EU. Like I say, we're going to be seeing this here in the UK in the not too distant future. Like I say, we've got a 15-year ticking time bomb to take care of. In the meantime, farmers are all right. But after that 15 years are up, remember, that's going to be a gradually reducing tariff scale. So over that 15-year time period, UK farmers are going to be under increasing pressure from these ever cheaper and a lot more Australian import products. UK farmers are already in a huge problem at the moment because you've had the removal, of course, of the common agricultural policy, and of course the cap which they got paid for as recompense for a lot of the subsidies that happen on the continent. So the EU Commission said, okay, it's only fair that you get some sort of recompense. So they got that. They no longer get that. Instead, they've now got the ELEM system, which does not give them any money for actually producing food. It gives them money for being environmental land management. And as we've reported before, farmers are not happy with this replacement scheme. Ultimately, you've got a problem where you've got British farming is essentially the Tories and the Brexiteers are signing away all these trade deals in a desperate bid to try and justify Brexit, not realizing, as we said, that Boris Johnson and Liz Truss have basically sold the farm. You're going to have huge problems. And one thing we always said that Brexit was going to uncover was that people, or at least the British public, was going to have to find out the hard way what trade deals actually mean. One thing I've always said is you look around the world outside the EU and trade deals are big politics. Governments win elections on trade deals. They are big politics everywhere else around the world, but we haven't had to deal with that type of politics because we've let the EU handle it. The single market has been big enough and successful enough to be able to be, handle itself. But now you've had the Australians come in, make outrageous demands, as you've seen here reported, basically based on the fact that, you know, the UK caved and gave them everything we want. So come on, guys, cave to us, give us everything we want as well. The other thing, of course, was geographic locations, and of course, we've said this before. If you make a Cornish pasty, well, it has to come from Cornwall for it to be a Cornish, to be called a Cornish pasty. The Australians didn't want to do that because they wanted to have products made in Australia that, weren't made in their geographical, shall we say, location, so that then they could, shall we say, sneakily compete with these other products that are made in those geographic locations. So the Australians balked at that as well. Even though a lot of countries around the world already agree to that, they said, no, we're not going to do that because, we want to, shall we say, make some Australian champagne, as they say. And of course, only champagne can come from champagne. So these trade deals essentially it fell through, and it wasn't because the the Australians were better negotiators or the EU failed in some spectacular way. It was because the Australians over demanded, putting forward what would be a very bad deal, and the EU said no, thank you, effectively turning down a bad deal, which is what Boris Johnson and Liz Truss should have done with the Australian trade deal as well. But as we said, they sold the farm for, well, probably a bag of beans. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.